Stephanie, thank you so much for being here with the Enthuse Foundation. We're so excited to talk to you today. Just to make sure that I am using pronouns correctly, what pronouns do you prefer?
My pronouns are she, her.
Awesome. Great. So tell me a little bit about Blendoor.
Blendoor is a diversity, equity, and inclusion analytics and employer branding platform. We help companies by providing them a benchmark for how they are performing across several different metrics of DEI relative to their industry peers in a way to amplify their employer brand and thus increase hiring opportunities of diverse candidates, while also providing a standard and consistent metric by which job seekers, investors, consumers, and the like can accurately assess how well your organization is performing against their diversity goals and commitments.
Awesome. And why did you find the need to start this platform?
So we started the company focused on mitigating unconscious bias in entry-level hiring. We built a tool that removed candidate name and photo from resumes and would algorithmically match jobs to candidates based on skills, experience, work experience, and skills. What we found was that mitigating bias at the top of the funnel was good in terms of providing a wider pipeline of talent, but there were many more challenges operationally happening within companies that were preventing those candidates from converting to actual hires. And then once hired, preventing them from actually being able to succeed and belong in those cultures. And so we developed this score called Blend Score to provide companies, as mentioned, a bigger picture of their DEI performance. And we'd get on calls and clients would be far more interested in their score. Job seekers were also seeking to differentiate companies where they could succeed. So yeah, we found a niche within this whole sort of diversity recruiting industry that hadn't been filled, and so we are striving to be the gold standard, kind of like U.S. News World Report or the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index for the ways in which these things are measured and reported in the future.
Got it. And when did you start the company?
Started the company in 2015.
Got it. And just you, or were there co-founders involved?
Early team member. So I started the company in May, and then we brought on Dan in October. And then subsequently just built the company. We've had 12 employees at max, but we've employed 32 people over the course of 5 years.
That's amazing. So how do you, just for understanding, for context, how do you define diversity and inclusion? Is it just based on race? Are we also talking about sexual orientation, religion? How do you define it in your ratings?
Yeah, so we're looking at the simplest way based on the federal government's protected classes. So people with disabilities, veterans, women, underrepresented minorities, LGBTQ. That goes into our blend score. What we also measure in terms of inclusion are any programs, policies, or initiatives that companies have in place covering those protected classes, but also parents, people with certain religious beliefs, uh, lower socioeconomic status or background, I should say, returning citizens. Um, what else do we track? Oh, so in tech, people over 40 are underrepresented in individual contributor roles. So we also look at that. So yeah, we kind of pick protected classes of our own based on signals that we're seeing in the market of ways in which companies have developed programs and policies beyond just what the federal government's 4 or 5 classes are.
Got it. That makes sense. And so we talked about this offline, but I'm going to bring it online.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about funding and how you're funding. And I know that you mentioned that that was a challenge, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that journey.
Yeah, so we've raised a little under $2 million in total over the course of 6 years, which has been great. It's helped us hire quite a few really critical roles that I otherwise would have had challenges doing if just bootstrapped.
Right.
But at the same time, we haven't really been able to scale as quickly as I would have liked. So things have just taken a lot longer to develop and grow, but they're trade-offs. I still own a significant percentage of the company, and the investors that we do have are really, really supportive. Most of them are social impact focused, and so really thinking triple bottom line and long, big term picture. It's very patient capital that we've raised, so that's really good. But it's interesting because I kind of threw myself into this world of unconscious bias and understanding all the different ways in which bias shows up and impacts our day-to-day outcomes. And it's very, very clear that Silicon Valley's venture capital community has a bias problem, unconscious and conscious. So it's yeah, it's certainly been a challenge. I think it's like 83% of venture capitalists are white men. So, and as a Black woman, I'm probably the farthest from an identity perspective and even a cultural perspective with an American white man. And so, yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging to build those relationships and challenging to get the benefit of the doubt. I think one of the things we take for granted is how often when you're meeting someone and engaging with someone in a professional capacity, you extend a little bit more empathy when there are factors that are relatable. But when you are void of those, it makes you more risky, right? And that's ultimately what venture capital is a risk assessment.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's just been really, really challenging in a lot of ways, a waste of valuable time that could have been spent on building the company. But, we do what we can with what we've got.
Right. And what about going, and maybe you have already done this, going away from VCs and more angel funding and more, now there's a lot of grant programs. Is that something that has been available to you, and what has been your experience in trying to go down those paths?
Yes, I haven't been as aggressive in pursuing angel investors as I should have been. We do have a handful on our cap table. Some are in groups. So Pipeline Angels is a really big angel investment group focused on women angels that want to give cash infusions to social impact focused companies. So that was actually our first check, came from Pipeline Angels. And then we have Laszlo Bach, who's the former head of people operations at Google, who's a big angel investor. Brian O'Kelly, who is the former CEO of App Dynamics. So we do have some big angels, and they have been great. But money isn't necessarily the biggest value that you get from an investor, right? You're also acquiring access to their networks and their infrastructure and their hiring capabilities. And in some cases, when you get a big brand name investor, it's another signal to the market that, this is a great company, right? So you don't get that when you take angel money as much. So, trade-offs.
That's a very, very interesting point that I think sometimes gets overlooked because we're like, cash, cash, cash. We need the cash right now. But there's more to it. Just like when you take a job, there's more than just the salary that you get.
Yeah, a lot more.
Exactly. So getting a little bit further along, and you mentioned this a little bit, how has the public reacted to your company? I know that you've received a lot of media attention, but has the response been positive? The companies that you work with? Tell me a little bit about that, especially I would say over the past year, where we've definitely had a reinvigoration, a reignition of the D&I conversations in the workplace.
Public relations has been extraordinarily wonderful for us in every way imaginable. I mean, yeah, of all the things and challenges of starting a company, PR and just the response to what we're doing has been far greater and better than I could have ever anticipated. The response, particularly over the past year, has been especially good because of our pivot. We released a press release back in November of 2020 that we were no longer focused on mitigating bias in entry-level hiring because it just wasn't working. And I realized that we were kind of a pawn in this diversity theater. And I didn't want that to be the legacy of the company, to be known as just another check the box solution that companies buy and put a logo on their website to say, hey, look at us, we're trying, even though nothing's getting better, right? And so once we announced that we were releasing a product focused on accountability and really cutting through the noise of a lot of the virtue signaling, people were elated, and Bloomberg signed on to do an exclusive for our State of DEI and Tech report, which came out on the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Definitely something from a product and design perspective that we're thinking critically about.
Right. It's that quantitative, qualitative thing. And so what the numbers say, and then what somebody's actual experience behind it.
Yeah. What we're developing though is a Find My Fit app. So like you sign on, you self-identify by race, gender, ability, religion, core values. And based on that, we tell you which companies you're most likely to succeed and belong in, so that it's a bit more tailored as opposed to these like broad diversity rankings where it's like, this is the best company to work, but it's like, best company for who, So we're trying to algorithmically tailor our recommendations based on identity and values for that very reason.
Right. That makes sense. But talking about a little bit about the product model and target audience from a business standpoint. So you mentioned Bloomberg has worked with you guys. We're both in the DMV area, so understanding that there are a lot of nonprofits that maybe don't have the same budget as a corporation, but still it's important to understand their rating. Is there different kind of tiers if I'm a nonprofit and I want to work with you guys versus a corporate entity?
Yeah, we haven't yet begun working with nonprofits. We are going sector by sector. So we started with tech, we're now going into finance, but it is in our roadmap to start thinking about public sector and nonprofits. The reasons why nonprofits are relatively later in our roadmap is because we haven't seen the maturity or sophistication yet around addressing racial disparities and gender disparities. Well, gender disparities aren't quite as stark in nonprofit as they are. But we haven't yet seen the maturity in even recognizing that, like, oh, I think it was something like 90% of grants go to white-led nonprofits or something. I think it's even bigger than that. Ford Foundation did this like big study and everyone was so shocked and appalled. And it's like, well, you guys aren't actively doing anything to really recruit, measure, or partner with feeder orgs in schools to change it. And so this is what happens. Diversity isn't an organic thing. You have to actively pursue it. And so we're really only trying to focus to start on companies that already have one, recognize that they have a problem. Two, establish some semblance of programming or policies to improve. And three, build some infrastructure for measurement. That's really the biggest piece of it, because our thesis is you can't fix what you don't measure. So if you aren't even tracking the race, gender, socioeconomic background of your leadership teams and your white collar workforce, then you're not quite yet ready for the products and services that we offer.
Got it. That absolutely makes sense. So we talked a little bit about your experience as a woman, as a Black woman, but now kind of shifting gears, it is Pride Month. And so talking about your experience as being a member of the LGBTQ community. So combining all of those things, you have a very unique perspective. And I would love to hear, if you've unfortunately faced any discrimination, and if so, how have you navigated that and really been the strong, amazing person that you are today?
Yeah, so I'm the B in the LGBTQ, and the B showed up really late after being married to a man, a firefighter, no less, for a while. And so I've learned that of all of those letters, there's a lot of diversity in our experiences. So it's a hard question for me to answer because of all of my identities. My bisexuality um, has a lot less impact on my day-to-day life than my race and my gender and my socioeconomic background. Um, in many ways, my being a part of this community has opened doors because it's created another string of commonality. So remember earlier I mentioned that I have very little in common with an American cisgender white male, but I have a lot more in common if that American cisgender white male is gay. And so I've gotten more meetings, I've gotten more opportunities because of that, and more access because of that. Very rarely have I experienced any explicit discrimination because of my sexuality. That happens because of race and gender.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you have not faced discrimination because
Explicit, not that I know of. I'm sure it's happening, but I don't I can't, for sure attribute it to that.
right. But it still breaks my heart to hear, being a woman, being a Black woman, that you have faced that and you have mentioned that. But because it is Pride Month and there are unique and I want to make sure that we cover them. How can companies provide support to their LGBTQ employees? And you mentioned you wouldn't necessarily know that somebody is a member of the community without them explicitly telling you. And that is obviously, you don't want to single anybody out, but maybe when you're filling out job applications, but once you get hired, they usually don't ask you those questions. So how do you measure that you're taking care of your employees without maybe knowing?
Yeah, well, I will say, for some in this community, you do know, right? Which is why I emphasize cisgender versus transgender, or non-binary versus or male versus female. So I have cis privilege, but that is not the case across the board, and therefore there are things that companies can do to make their workplaces more equitable and inclusive, for for members of our community who cannot hide their differences, or what might be assumed to be their sexual orientation. But when it comes to the LGBTQ community, the Human Rights Campaign has done a really good job of outlining very explicitly what companies can and should do to create more equitable and inclusive workplaces. So that is sort of a really easy resource. What I always recommend for companies who are specifically thinking about measurement is tailor your pulse surveys, your employee engagement surveys, so that you are capturing the experiences of different demographics of people, who obviously will have to self-identify. But yeah, tailoring your feedback mechanisms to ensure that you can disaggregate how different types of people may be not just satisfied with their work, but also utilizing the benefits that you provide employees. I think even the benefits packages that companies are offering could use a bit of a facelift to be
Mhm.
more inclusive in terms of the value add for different demographics of people. So whether it's um, gender reassignment surgery assistance or mental health, additional mental health resources for non-binary individuals, or adoption assistance. My wife and I just got pregnant, and it was very expensive.
Oh my
It's a lot.
God.
Yeah, it was a learning experience.
Congratulations.
Thanks, thanks. But having been, as I tell people, it's like I've been both a wife and a husband. Having been both on both sides, it's like, oh, this is hard. We should be getting help with this. Like, it's just so much more you have to do and consider and pay for as a gay couple trying to get pregnant. But I think very forward-thinking companies will solicit feedback around those things and track and measure it in a very intentional way.
We see rainbows all around in June. And then July next week comes around and the rainbows go away. And it's like, okay, we only celebrate Pride in June. What about the other 11 months of the year? So what can companies do to reach out to their LGBTQ consumers? What can we do year round to really show that we are supportive rather than just June where we hang our rainbow flag outside?
I think it's a matter of really operationalizing inclusion. So you don't necessarily need to have a permanent rainbow flag, but it should be clear in your product development, your design processes, your sales strategy, that you are thinking about, that you have put checks and balances in place to ensure that one, what you're building and selling and doing isn't discriminatory towards LGBTQ people, but two, that you're being proactive in your design thinking process, your development processes, to to capture and add value to these different demographics of people, to LGBTQ people. The best example I've seen of this is Subaru. There's a whole, I think, like HBS case study on this, because they were struggling to differentiate, in the late 90s when the Japanese car makers were just taking over so much market share. And someone came in and said, like, hey, a lot of lesbians for some reason drive Subarus. Like, maybe we should lean into this. And it obviously had capitalistic motivation. But once they realized the value, it became a part of their DNA. So there was no need to have you know, a, a program or a special month or a flat. It's just like, oh, this is what we do now. So, I don't think companies have to go so far as to, have a whole marketing campaign dedicated to LGBTQ, but there should be, across the board, ways in which companies are considering different demographics of people, of marginalized people.
Absolutely. And then finally, because I have you and because you wear a lot of different demographic hats,
Mhm.
from a member of the LGBTQ plus community, what resources or what advice would you give to other LGBTQ entrepreneurs that maybe are a little bit apprehensive about bringing their full selves to pitch meetings, to, their job, whatever the case may be? What advice would you give them?
The biggest benefit of the internet is finding communities. Find your community and lean in. My first big pitch was at Lesbians Who Tech, and I was not out to any of my family members. And so but I needed the money and I needed the exposure and I wanted the community. And so I did it and I won. And I posted pictures online and everyone thought I lied about being gay to get the money. And so I just laughed it off because, again, being a cisgender bisexual woman and a Black cisgender bisexual woman as to boot, I just didn't feel like I needed to come out. I didn't have a girlfriend, I was still dating men and, it just, but it opened so many doors for me such that I was able to be my full self in pitch meetings, in business proceedings, because I, was invited to participate in Start Out, which is an entrepreneurship focused LGBTQ group. I started attending Ramba, which is Reaching Out MBA professional student organization. And then just going to meetups and finding really neat stuff online on Facebook events and various other groups. And there's just so much out there now that I think, you can really tap into enough resources within the LGBTQ community to get started. I'm not necessarily saying only do business in these spaces, but it will allow you to at least get your feet wet and build some momentum and build some relationships that can, help you expand.
Awesome. Now, putting on your Black woman entrepreneur hat, what advice would you give to other Black women about starting their own business? You talked a little bit more that there are more challenges there. And so what resources have been helpful for you and what other advice would you give?
Similar, actually. So professional networks have been equally as valuable. I actually created one myself called Visible Figures. We've been operating in stealth for the past 4 years, but we are just getting our 501c3 this week. Actually, we just got our EIN.
It's been a very exciting month for you.
So what's really neat about Visible Figures and why it's been so valuable for me as a Black woman entrepreneur is that we are all venture backed, right? So it's a very small niche. And there are only there are only 93 Black women in the world that have ever raised $1 million or more in venture capital, right? So almost all 93 of those women are in this group, in addition to about 50 or so others. And it just gives me so much life because just we just talk and share our experiences and you realize like, oh great, I thought it was just me, right? And it's like it's just the validation of who you are and what you're doing that just brings so much strength and energy when you're doing something where you're so severely underrepresented. So I found that to be extremely valuable. Um, what else? What other advice would I give for Black and or women entrepreneurs? I would also say just general advice is be really clear on what you're trying to achieve. If you want to build a business that grows 10x and can grow 10x, um, it's very different than a lifestyle business where you can make $1 million in revenue, but you're not seeking to employ 100 people. And so pursuing venture capital doesn't make sense. It'll be a waste of your time, but there are other resources you can tap into. So the more that you understand what your end goal is, the better and more efficiently you'll be able to use your startup resources, because I think that's the biggest mistake women and people of color make is they watch Shark Tank or Silicon Valley, and they're like, yeah, I want to do that. And it's like, are you sure? Are you sure, one, that you're willing to put in the time and energy required for that? But two, are you sure that what you're doing, the industry that you're in, the market opportunity is that big? And if not, you really need to do some research and talk to more people before going down that path, because it can be really heartbreaking if you don't really understand your capabilities and the capabilities of what you're building.
Amazing. I think that that's awesome advice for everybody. So that is it. Those are all the
Great.
questions. Thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom. We really, really appreciate it.